I'm delighted to be here. I am, first and foremost, I'm not an astrologer. I can't predict the future. I have no idea what's going to happen in 15 minutes time, but I can assure you that you're going to have fun in the next 20 minutes. I'm going to be talking about the future of psychiatric services in the 21st century. And I'm going to be presenting some thoughts as to where I think psychiatry is going. And I'm also going to be talking about a report that the Mental Health Foundation produced last year, an inquiry panel which I co-chaired with Lord Carlisle. That's a good start. Okay. Two issues about psychiatry. Psychiatry is as a profession in transition, simply because we are reaching that stage where we're beginning to understand more about the brain, more about the structures of the brain, and more about how brain functions. And pathoplasticity. Certainly when I trained as a doctor far too many years ago, we were told that once the brain cells die, they die and nothing happens. And we know now that that's not true. That even in your later age, you can the plasticity of the brain cells is still there, and you can learn new things and you can form new connections. And there are certain imperatives in psychiatry. Part of the transition is really that it's a very embattled and bitter profession. Psychiatrists can't stop fighting each other. People believe that unless you can demonstrate something in the brain, it doesn't exist. Life is not like that. We all know, everybody in this room would have been bereaved at some point. And I'm sure at that particular point, your brain showed no changes. And some of us would have gone through abnormal grief reaction. And there are issues of both culturally and socially in how society defines and what is abnormal grief and how long it lasts and so on and so forth. But major transition in psychiatry in the 20th century has been that since the discovery of drugs, we've moved away from asylums. All my training in Leicestershire was in asylums. And after finishing my training, I have never worked in an asylum. So things have changed, but what that means is that we're increasingly, when people get admitted, they get admitted for very short, sharp, intensive periods, which means that there are problems once they go out. That, if services are not in place which provide continuing care at home or home treatment or early intervention, and I'll come back to some of those. Challenges in the early part of 21st century have been many. Government policies at the top of the list. Policies get made without any evidence whatsoever. Between 1948 and 1974, 26 years, NHS had no reform, no reorganization, nothing. Between 1978 and 2014, there has been a reform every 2 years. So what does that tell us? Politicians cannot, if Lord Tebbit was here, it would have been a very interesting conversation. Politicians cannot keep their hands off the National Health Service. I can't understand why. Maybe because they have to be seen to be doing something, and it's kind of visible thing. So if nothing else, set up some targets. There's increasing specialization within psychiatry, which is a good thing. I'm not criticizing it, and I'm all for specialization. But what that means is when you become super specialized, you're just interested in your bit of the patch. You cannot see what the bigger picture is. And part of the issue that I would sort of urge you to look at is almost an impressionist picture. There are dots, but once they come together, you can see the big picture. And that is part of the task for all of us to look at, and why mental health services and services for patients who are really the most vulnerable individuals in our societies. How do we look at that? Psychiatry hasn't covered itself with glory either. We've had several scandals, not only in asylums, but also circumstances where psychiatrists were sleeping with their patients, their colleagues knew, nothing got done. Public expectations have changed, and I sit in a clinic and quite often people will come with a printout from the web saying, I want this medication. And on one occasion I was absolutely horrified because I'd never even heard of the medication. So we sort of sat down and Googled it, as one does. And fortunately for me, it was not available in the UK, it had not been approved here. You know, great stuff. And that power relationship is changing dramatically, which is a good thing. But I don't think the profession has learned that how do we engage with patients to make that bit more equal. 4 areas which are on the horizon that we need to be thinking about, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. Psychopharmacogenomics. We will all be carrying our genome maps in our mobile phones. And I can guarantee that in 10, 15, 20, 25 years time, you plug the mobile phone into your computer and it'll tell you, these medications you're allergic to, these are the most suitable medications. Go and ask your doctor for that. But 5 years ago, the Federal Drug Authority in Drug Administration in America approved a pill for blood pressure only for African Americans. So that's the beginning. And increasingly there will be drugs which will be very specific. Increasingly we are beginning to understand emotions. And for a very long time, we weren't sure whether emotions came first, thoughts came next, and your thoughts affected emotions, emotions affected thoughts. And I think we're beginning to understand as the brain structures become clearer, and we know that, the role different parts of the brain play and, where the neurotransmitters are and what's happening. Globalization has changed the world in lots of ways. It has made a lot of difference in terms of movement of people. So it always amuses me when people, politicians talk about migration. And, they talk about, people coming to use the NHS. Various travel companies in India are offering cataract surgery, hernia surgery with 2 weeks holidays attached, travel around India after that, all for £1,000. Which means that the resources and people are moving fairly rapidly, and that brings about a change in the way we look at the world and the way we think about, and that's particularly important in psychiatry. People are living longer. As people live longer, there is much more comorbidity between physical illness and psychiatric disorders. There was a news report, I think last week, which sort of suggested that we look at our mobile phones 251 times a day, which means that the pressure on our neck is so much. Now, that's physical bit of it. A nephew of mine from India emailed me and sort of said, will you be my friend on Facebook? And I said, no. I'm not on Facebook. I have no intentions of going on Facebook. And I got a very sheepish response back saying, but I only have 16 friends. And I wrote back saying, but I only have 5. So the ideas of relationship and friendships are changing dramatically. And likes they're not deep friendships. They are people you really care about. And what does that do to our ego, our self-esteem, and how we see the world? New therapies are being invented. Lots of therapies without therapists. You sit in front of a computer and do your cognitive behavior therapy. Is that a good thing? I don't know. We need to know what the long-term outcome is and so on and so forth. Stigma And again, Mind have done some fantastic work on time to change campaign, and stigma is going down, but stigma will never go away, because part of the issue is that we need to create the other in order to validate who we are. And it's far easier to do with somebody who's mentally ill, because there may not be any physical symptoms. It's just their behavior, the way they look, the way they dress, the way they walk. And it used to be absolutely wonderful about 30 years ago when you saw somebody mumbling along on the pavement, you immediately thought, looks like psychosis. Now everybody's on a mobile phone and mumbling away, and it's not a psychiatric disorder anymore. Public mental health is a major, major, major challenge, and I think we need to rise to it. 3/4 of psychiatric disorders in adulthood start below the age of 24. Half of the psychiatric disorders start below the age of 15. So we need to be targeting interventions in schools with parenting skills, teaching parents how to bring up children. And I'm kind of half jokingly, if you were to drive a car, in order to get a license, you need a theory paper and a test. In order to be a parent, you don't need anything. You can just go and become a parent. So surely all those old traditions in the families where grandparents and grandmothers taught how the children should be brought up in discipline and so on and so forth, and whole attachment issues have gone out of the window. At the same time, society is changing, because different ages deal with issues in very different ways. People born between 1982 and 2000 look at technology in a very different way. Their ideas of communication are very different. Work style is very different. Work-life balance is very different. And views of loyalty and authority are very different. So we need to see how that generation is going to deal with. All of us are growing older. We need a number of services which provide us with support and different issues. We may need to learn new technologies as we grow old. Say, how do we engage that? And there are a whole host of new psychiatric conditions. Who would have heard of internet addiction or internet sex addiction a few years ago? In Japan, there's this new condition called hikikomori, which is a social withdrawal state. So teenagers kind of withdraw into their rooms and don't go out. Now, is that kind of depression? Is that some kind of social pressure? We don't know. And there are changes in symptoms. When I was training, quite often if my patients were deluded, they would talk about mustard gas coming from underneath their bed, which was causing problems. And then it became sort of, cosmonauts and astronauts, and then it was CIA agents, and now it's all about, Facebook and Edward Snowden and others. So the contents change, the way we deal with it change. And it's also, currently psychiatric services focus on mental illness, not on mental health. And we talk about mental health, and it's one of those terms which has kind of taken currency. And I was at a meeting where somebody stood up and said, so-and-so suffers from mental health. Surely that's a good thing, even if it is suffering. So we need to look at how we change this 3-generational cycle of poverty, abuse, unemployment in some deprived area. Social determinants of health are very, very, very important. Central line, go east on Liverpool Street. Michael Marmot's work tells us that for every tube station going east, your longevity drops. So what does that tell us? And we don't even think about what we should be doing. So how do we deal with that? And this is very quickly, in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to give you headlines from this report. We set up a 19-member inquiry panel, collected oral evidence from 50 individuals in 12 sessions around the 4 nations. 1,500 plus provided written evidence, and as I mentioned earlier, Lord Carlisle and I co-chaired it. And we defined mental health services as services commissioned and provided by the National Health Service, commissioned by the NHS and local authorities, and we looked at public mental health. We wanted to raise the topic and promote debate and whether the mental health services would be fit for purpose in 20 to 30 years' time or not. We were not predicting the future. We know that healthcare and social care are very separate systems and they have very different set of priorities, and we were not commenting on social inequalities, but I would like you to bear that in mind, that there are issues about poverty, unemployment, poor housing, homelessness that we need to be thinking about. So there were 6 themes which emerged. Firstly, that the services need to be personalized, engaging patients and their carers and families as equal partners. And interestingly, one of the major issues was using patients as peer support for other patients. So somehow banking of resources and using an asset-based approach. And it was basically building capacity and investment in services, but focusing on public health agenda and public mental health, and I'll come back to that. And the model that was put forward was that patients need to come out of their own corner fighting, like civil rights and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender right movements. So it raises some sort of very interesting questions. And there was an issue about changing the funding for integrated care. And integrated care in this is hospital and community, primary care and secondary care, social care and health care, and physical, i.e. acute care and mental health care, and I'll come back to those. It is about trust and it's about communication. I have sort of changed my mind at least twice. That originally I was in favor of merging mental health and physical health services. And then it became very clear, if you look at the figures, mental health trusts are sitting on piles of money. Between all the mental health trusts, there's about 850 million pounds worth of surplus, whereas acute trusts are in financial trouble. So if there was a merger, that money would go into pediatric care, cardiac care, etc. But the positive model in Canada is that the total integration, but funding for mental health is ring-fenced in perpetuity. So nobody can touch that amount. So maybe we need to sort of think about those kind of models. Services are incredibly fragmented. We need to look at physical and social care and employment and housing. Again, when I was training, we used to have a district rehabilitation officer who used to come to the ward rounds and identify patients and get them into paid employment till Mrs. Thatcher got rid of them. And there's no such phenomenon at the moment. So next 20 years are going to be integrated care, but with fewer resources. We need to look at secondary care itself, because most junior people are providing care to the most needy people. So we need to change the way we offer services, whether they should be consultant provided or consultant led. We need to have a debate, because either is going to be an expensive option. There was a sort of suggestion that there are ways that maybe we ought to be having more crisis houses where patients can refer themselves for short admission, 48, 72 hours. The old function of asylums is gone completely. All of us need asylum, peace and quiet and space to think things through. And most of the wards, certainly in England, are 110, 120% capacity. So there's no room. So primary care, we need to, maybe this integration needs to be emotional rather than a physical one. Maybe we need to think about joint assessments with GPs or providing support. Should we be looking at polyclinic models where key secondary care services sit with the GP to try and offer services? We need to focus much more on recovery and a range of services, daycare, respite care, carer support, family support, offering a tube map to the patients. So if you need to go there, this is what you do, this is where you go, this is where you change, and that's how you get there. It's a public health issue, and I'm not going to go through that, but except to say that families and teachers need to be involved at a very early stage. Where should it sit? Should it sit with local councils or should it be National Health Service? Again, we need to have a debate about that. One of the crazy things in psychiatry, there are many crazy things in psychiatry, and I'm kind of standing proof of that. Somebody reaches 16, they have to be handed over to another service. Somebody reaches 65, they have to be handed over to another service. Why? Why can't we work through lifespan? And that raises very clear issues about specialism and generalism. And how does that fit in? And that part of the sort of psychiatry's contract with society we need to sort of build on. And how do we do that? And one of the options is that we work with the third sector much more closely than we have done so far. And that integration needs to be better managed. Do we need sort of 6 subspecialties? How do we boost research in social aspects and translational aspects? How do we use social media to educate patients, to get feedback? Information systems. In Kerala, they had started a wonderful system that patients' notes were all in a notebook, and patient kept the notebook and he or she could show it to whosoever they wanted to. So on the same principle, why don't we give patients the data on a USB stick, which is theirs? There is a kind of central store, but they can sort of take it and share it, show it to anybody that they wish to. So of the written responses, I'm just going to sort of not go through the graphs, but people want holistic, integrated, local service which is easy to access. And this ease of access is not about geographical access. It's also about emotional access. Do I feel comfortable? Do I trust this person? Do I trust this individual? And it has to be a recovery-based co-production with the patients. And it is, do we create local hubs, local well-being centers, community-based, home-based services? How do we bring back those asylums in the true sense of the word and crisis provisions in the community as alternatives? How do we train GPs? How do we train psychiatrists to deal with physical conditions? It's a real scandal that patients with psychiatric disorders die 15 to 20 years younger than those who don't have psychiatric disorders. So if we are talking about parity of esteem, that's what we ought to be focusing on, not necessarily on the resources and not necessarily on the research funding. What we ought to be focusing on is the outcome-based parity and human rights-based parity. I've talked about peer support and prevention, and I'm not going to go through that, but we need better technology to share better information and self-help. So these are exciting times for psychiatry. There are lots of changes afoot. And I think if we don't take this opportunity, it's a chance in a lifetime. We need to think outside the box. There are various models around the world that work very well. Loads of excellent public mental health stuff going on. In Pakistan, there was a program a few years ago where students in schools were taught how to identify epilepsy and psychosis in their villages. So once they identified, they reported that to the teachers who did a more formal assessment. And then they referred to the visiting community health worker or community midwife, who then referred them on to doctors and then psychiatrists. So we need to look at different ways of tiered up approaches. In Thailand, most places have volunteers who are elected by the local wards. Each volunteer is responsible for 10 people, 10 households, and they would be the first port of call if there is a disaster or there is a crisis. So I think we need to put our heads together to think about in different ways and look at the integration between social care, mental health, physical health, primary care, and secondary care. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening.